$23. That's what stood between my 3 children and nothing. Not a savings account. Not a relative willing to answer the phone. 23 crumpled dollars at the bottom of a purse I hadn't cleaned out since the last time I bought tomatoes at the farmer's market. Back when I still had a kitchen to bring them home to. My husband had been dead 8 months when his brother opened the front door that morning and told me I had until noon to leave. He didn't raise his voice, didn't need to. The decision had already been made probably weeks before, in a room I wasn't invited into by men who had already divided up what was left of my life and assigned me the portion they believed I deserved, which was nothing. I had a 13-year-old son who carried bags without complaining, a 6-year-old daughter whose shoe had split down the sole, a baby burning with fever in my arms, and a road stretching out ahead of me under the Oklahoma sun with no destination at the end of it. But here is what my brother-in-law didn't know, what no one knew, including me. My husband had died protecting a secret buried in a house I hadn't found yet, inside walls I hadn't opened, written in the hand of a woman who'd been dead for decades, but who had been waiting all that time for someone exactly like me to come and finish what she started. This is that story. I learned early that crying doesn't feed your children. I learned even earlier that explanations don't change the mind of someone who's already decided. So when Warren opened the door that morning and told me I had until noon to get out of the house, I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I did what I've always done. I took a breath, turned around, and went to pack my children's things. Caleb followed me without asking a single question. He's 13 years old, and he's already learned how to read his mother's silence. Maisie stood frozen in the hallway, her thumb drifting toward her mouth, staring at her uncle with the expression of a child who doesn't understand what's happening, but feels that something is broken. And Eli slept in the crook of my arm, his forehead too warm, his breathing shorter than it should be for a baby of 8 months. I didn't take much. What I took was what mattered. The documents went into a plastic bag inside a cloth bag so they wouldn't get wet if it rained. 3 changes of clothes for each child. The wedding photograph, the only one I had of Garrett and me together on a day when he smiled for real, a wide and unguarded smile that I never saw often enough and now would never see again. His wedding ring, the one I slipped off his finger at the funeral home and wrapped in a piece of soft cloth. My mother's Bible, the one she gave me the day I got married, with the pages yellowed at the edges and her name written in pencil on the first leaf in handwriting that slanted to the right the way mine does. And $23. $23 that had been sitting in the bottom of my purse, crumpled and forgotten from the last time I went to the market in town. I stood in the bedroom looking at those bills in the palm of my hand, while Caleb tied Maisie's shoes in the front room. I thought, this is it. This is everything that stands between my children and nothing. I put the money back. I picked up the bags. I walked out. Warren was on the porch when I came through the front door. Boyd stood behind him a little further back in the shade, the way he'd stood his entire life, letting his older brother do what needed doing, and pretending it had nothing to do with him. The two of them watched me with a look I recognized. It's the look of men who've already convinced themselves they're right, who've already built the justification inside their own heads, and don't need to hear anything else. No need for drama, Warren said. His voice was flat, almost bored, the voice of a man conducting routine business. Garrett's gone. The house belongs to us. You always knew that's how it was." I said nothing. It was Maisie who spoke. She has this voice, sometimes small and serious, older than her 6 years have any right to produce. "Are we coming back, Uncle Warren?" Warren didn't answer her. He looked at me as if the question were my responsibility, as if I were supposed to resolve it right there in front of my children, with the sun already hot at 10 in the morning, and Eli's weight pulling at my arm. "Yes, sweetheart," I said to Maisie. "We'll come back." I don't know if I believed it when I said it, but I said it because there are things you tell your children, not because they're true yet, but because the child needs the shape of the words to hold on to while you figure out how to make them true. I started walking, but before I reached the gate, I stopped. Not because I wanted to, because something pulled at me the way instinct pulls below thought, below decision. The kitchen window was half open. It was always half open in summer because of the heat, and I was passing along the side of the house where the window sat low enough that voices carried without trying. Warren was speaking in that tight, low register that men use when they want to sound calm, but their jaw is clenching around every syllable. She doesn't know about the files. She never knew. And Garrett Boyd's voice, quieter, almost reluctant. Garrett knew. But she won't find what he hid. She won't find anything. She'll disappear. Single mother, 3 kids, no money, no family, no nothing. She vanishes. I stop breathing, not from fear, from necessity. Something inside me needed to record those words exactly as they were spoken, without distortion, without the blur of panic. I needed to hear what I had heard. Files. Garrett hid files. I had spent 4 years working as a records clerk at the county courthouse before Caleb was born. 4 years of filing land deeds, cross-referencing property transfers, cataloging mortgage documents, pulling probate records for attorneys who couldn't be bothered to do it themselves. I knew what the word files meant when it came out of a man's mouth with that particular weight. It didn't mean personal papers. It didn't mean letters or photographs. It meant documents with legal standing. Documents that proved something someone didn't want proved. I kept walking, but now there was a different stone in my chest. Not just the stone of grief. Something sharper. Something with edges. The sun at 11 in the morning on the Oklahoma Panhandle doesn't forgive anyone. It sits straight overhead like a judgment, and the land below it answers back with its own heat, rising from the red dirt. So you're caught between 2 fires with nowhere to hide. We walked the dirt road that led to the county highway. Me in front with Eli in one arm and the cloth bag over my shoulder. Caleb beside me carrying the bag with the documents. Maisie holding onto the hem of my shirt with one hand, her other hand swinging free at her side. The dust rose with every truck that passed from town, coating us in a fine orange powder that settled in the creases of our skin and turned our hair the color of the earth. Shade was rare. The few trees along the road were post oaks, and blackjack scrubby and low throwing shadows too small to stand in. We stopped under one of them after the first hour, and I gave the children water from the bottle I'd filled at the house before leaving. It was warm and tasted like plastic, but they drank it without complaint. Maisie was the first to say something, not from weakness. She's 6. She has every right to speak up about what hurts. Mama, my foot hurts. I looked down. Her shoe, the old one, the one that had already been getting tight, had split along the sole on one side. She'd been walking half limping without telling me. I set the bag on the ground, laid Eli on top of it carefully, and knelt in the red dirt to look at Maisie's shoe. I pulled the lace from one of my own sneakers and tied the sole back in place as best I could, wrapping it twice and knotting it tight. "Hold on a little longer," I said. She looked at me with those wide brown eyes that are the exact copy of her father's, and she didn't protest. She just nodded once the way Garrett used to nod when he accepted something difficult and kept walking. Caleb stayed quiet beside me. After a while, he said, without looking at me, "Mama, where are we going forward?" I answered. He accepted that as if it were a sufficient answer. There are things you teach your children without meaning to. The lesson that forward is a direction, even when you don't have a destination. That movement itself is a form of not giving up. The afternoon was harder than the morning. Eli wouldn't stop crying. The fever hadn't broken since the night before. And I knew he needed medicine. I knew he needed a doctor. I knew everything I didn't have the means to provide in that moment. I carried him in my arm, and he cried against my chest. And I hummed a melody my mother used to hum to me. No words, just the tune low and steady. And I tried not to think about what would happen if the fever climbed higher. Caleb carried both bags without a word of complaint. At some point, he said quietly, "The way you say something when you don't want to cause alarm, but you need it heard. Mama, there's someone behind us." I didn't stop walking. I asked him how long, since we left the dirt road, following at a distance. I glanced sideways slowly without turning my body. There was a figure back there, far enough not to be conversation, close enough to be intention. I couldn't make out features with the sun at that angle, just a shape, a man moving when we moved, stopping when we slowed. "Keep walking," I told Caleb. We kept walking, but now I was paying attention to everything. The distance of the footsteps behind us, the sound of every vehicle on the road, the position of Caleb ahead of me and Maisie at my side. I was calculating without stopping, without letting my face show anything. I learned that early, too. When there's danger, your face can't give information. Your face has to be a wall. The figure stayed. When the sun started dropping and the sky turned that deep copper orange that the Oklahoma plains produce at the end of the day, a color so saturated it looks painted, I was at my limit. Not the body's limit, though. The body was there, too. It was the limit of what you can endure without making a decision. I couldn't just keep walking. I needed to stop somewhere. Eli was worse. Maisie was limping even with the lace. Caleb's face was sunburned, and he hadn't drunk enough water. None of us had. That's when I saw the house. It sat on top of a low rise set back from the road by a narrow dirt track, overgrown with blue stem grass that rose to my waist on both sides. A big house, or one that had been big once. You could tell, even from a distance, that it was old, that it had been sitting there for a long time, without anyone asking it to be anything other than what it was. The porch sagged on one side. The walls were peeling in long strips of paint that had once been white and were now the color of old bone. The windows had no glass, and some of them just dark openings like eyes that had stopped looking. And on the right side, a massive bur oak grew with its branches reaching in every direction. Untrimmed, unpruned, a tree that had found its own shape, without anyone telling it what to be. Abandoned, clearly, but with walls, with a roof, with shade. Caleb looked at me. Here. I don't know why I said yes. I don't know what made me turn onto that dirt track instead of continuing on the road. It wasn't hope. Hope is too large a thing for the state I was in. It was something smaller and older. A kind of recognition, like when you look at a place and feel you've been there before, even though you know you haven't. A pull that doesn't come from the head. It comes from somewhere deeper. Somewhere that doesn't need reasons. Here, I said. We climbed the track. Behind us on the road, the figure stopped. I didn't turn to confirm, but I felt it. The way you feel when someone is watching you in a crowded room, that pressure on the back of your shoulders that tingle at the base of your skull. The figure was still looking. Let him look, I thought, and I went inside. The front door had no lock. It didn't need one. It was so swollen from years of humidity and heat and cold that it held shut by its own weight, wedged tight in the frame. Caleb put his shoulder against it, and it gave with a long groan like something that resented being woken. The smell that came from inside was earth and old wood, and something harder to name, not the smell of rot, the smell of stillness, of things that had been waiting without knowing they were waiting. I went in first. The hallway was wide with a floor of dark hardwood planks, thick with dust. Some of them buckled at the edges where moisture had gotten under. The walls had wallpaper peeling in long curling strips. A floral pattern so faded you couldn't make out what the flowers had been. Underneath, the pale plaster showed through like bone beneath skin. At the end of the hallway, a staircase. On either side, 2 closed doors. Maisie pressed herself against my leg without making a sound. Eli had stopped crying when we entered, which worried me more than the crying. I touched his forehead, still hot. But his eyes were open, looking at me with that infant attention that seems to understand more than it possibly can. "It's all right, baby," I whispered, to him and to myself. Caleb came in and closed the door behind us. He looked around with that careful way he has assessing the same way Garrett used to enter an unfamiliar place. That gesture cut through me, but it wasn't the time for that. "Anyone here?" he asked in a low voice. "Doesn't seem like it. Seems like nobody's been here in a long time." Seems. But I'd learned not to confuse seems with is. The first door opened into a large room with furniture covered by yellowed sheets. A sofa, a long table, a dark wood cabinet against the far wall. A fireplace that hadn't been used in decades, with old ash in the firebox and a thick cobweb stretching across the opening. Nothing useful for now. The second door opened into a shorter hallway that led to a small room at the back of the house. No furniture, but the window closed properly, and the floor was intact. No buckled planks, no gaps. And outside the window, the bur oak, its branches crossing the glass in a pattern that broke the wind. "Here," I said. Caleb didn't question it. He dropped the bags in the corner and went to get the sheets from the front room. I sat on the floor with Eli in my lap and called Maisie close. She came and leaned her head against my arm. Without saying anything, her eyes already heavy, "Mama," she said after a while. "What is it?" Are we staying here tonight? Yes. And tomorrow I ran my hand over her hair. Tomorrow we'll see. She accepted that the way children accept their mother's answer, when they're too tired to push further without questioning because sleep is more urgent than certainty. Caleb came back with 2 sheets and a quilt folded over his arm that had been draped across the sofa. He also had a different expression on his face. He stopped in the doorway and looked at me. "Mama, there's water." I looked at him. "There's a sink in this kitchen." I turned the handle and it came out brown at first, but then it ran clear. Water. It took me a full second to process the word. Then I stood past Eli to Caleb and went to the kitchen. It was a big room at the back of the house with wooden cabinets, a deep stone sink, an old cast-iron wood stove that wasn't going to work, and a solid wood table in the center, the kind that takes 4 men to move. I turned the handle. Brown came out, then orange, then clear. I put my hand under it, cold and clean. I turned it off, turned it on again, just to be sure. It worked. I'm not someone who cries over small things, but standing there in front of that old sink, in an abandoned house in the middle of nowhere, with $23 in my pocket, and 3 children and a baby whose fever was climbing the clean water running over my hand, made me feel something I couldn't name. It wasn't gratitude exactly. It was more primitive than that. It was the body recognizing that it wasn't going to die today. I washed Eli's forehead. I washed Maisie's foot where a large blister had formed on her heel. I washed Caleb's face and he didn't complain. Just closed his eyes while I passed the cool water over his sunburned skin. Then I washed my own face and stood there, looking at nothing for a long moment. Garrett knew. The words from the kitchen window came back without permission. If she finds the files he hid, files. Garrett never told me about any files. But Garrett was like that. He carried things inside until he was sure, until he had it all figured out, until he could put it in front of me without a gap or a loose end. That was his way. He never brought me a problem without bringing the attempt at a solution alongside it. He thought that was how you loved someone. You shielded them from the mess until you could hand them the answer clean and whole. I never decided if that was strength or weakness. Maybe it was both. That night, we split the last of the crackers from the bag and drank water from a cup I found in the kitchen cabinet. That was dinner. Maisie didn't complain. Caleb ate slowly, chewing longer than necessary, the way you do when you're trying to trick your stomach into thinking there's more than there is. Eli took a little water from my finger, which was all I could give him, and lay quiet in the dark of the back room, his eyes open, watching me with that baby focus that seems to see through walls. I made all 3 of them sleep before I allowed myself to lie down. I covered Maisie with the quilt, which was large enough for her and Caleb together. If they lay close, and they did without being asked the way children do, when instinct tells them that closeness is safety. I placed Eli between me and the wall, protected on both sides. I lay on my side with my arm folded under my head in place of a pillow, and stared at the dark wood ceiling above me. Outside, the Oklahoma night made its sounds, crickets in waves rising and falling, the wind moving through the bur oak with a sound like slow breathing. A screech owl somewhere in the distance calling out its single repeated note into the dark. I lay there thinking about Warren's words, thinking about Garrett, About Garrett in the last months before he died, how he sometimes disappeared for hours without explaining where he'd been. How he sometimes stayed up too late with a notebook in his hand, writing things I couldn't see from my side of the bed. How once I found a page with a name written on it, several times the same name repeated in different sizes, as if he were testing how it felt. Caldwell. Caldwell. The Caldwell property. I'd asked him about it at the time. He'd said it was nothing, just a land case he needed to understand better for work. Garrett worked in the county assessor's office handling rural property documentation. Sometimes he picked up old cases resolving survey disputes, clearing title clouds, sorting out decades-old boundary arguments that had sat in filing cabinets collecting dust. I thought that's what it was. Work. But what if it wasn't just work? I fell asleep on that thought. And it was from sleep that I was ripped awake when the footsteps sounded in the hallway. I lay frozen. I didn't move. I opened my eyes in the dark and did nothing but listen. Because when you're truly afraid, the body knows that premature movement is a mistake. You wait. You gather information. You let the threat identify itself before you reveal that you're awake. The footsteps were slow, heavy in a specific way. Not the heaviness of a large person, but the heaviness of an old person, someone who places each foot with deliberation. Because they know the floor is treacherous, because they've learned where the boards creak and where they hold. The footsteps stopped outside the door of the back room. Silence. A long silence in which I could hear my own heartbeat and the breathing of my children and nothing else. Then a voice, a woman's voice, old, calm, too calm to be a threat. But I didn't know that yet, so I didn't relax. Sleep, girl. You're exactly where you need to be. I stared at the door in the dark. I didn't respond. The footsteps resumed. They moved away down the hallway, climbed the staircase. I heard the specific creak of each step, a different pitch for each one, like the notes of a very old and very tired instrument. And then they were gone, absorbed into the upper floor. I stayed awake for the rest of the night. Not from fear, from attention. But the footsteps didn't come back. And my children slept through until morning without waking once. And when the sky began to lighten through the window where the bur oak's branches crossed the glass outside, I was still lying there, eyes open, staring at the ceiling, thinking about a name I didn't know. Caldwell. Morning came with the smell of coffee. I got up before the children, walked in my socks down the hallway, stopped at the entrance to the kitchen. There was a woman standing with her back to me, stirring something in a pot on top of a small propane camp stove I hadn't seen the night before. Small, bent at the shoulders, white hair pinned up with a bone hair clip. She wore a faded cotton house dress and a cloth apron tied at the waist. Her movements were slow but precise. The movements of someone who has done the same thing for decades and no longer needs to think about doing it. She didn't turn when I entered. "Sit down," she said. "Coffee's almost ready. There's cornbread from yesterday. Still good." I stood in the doorway. "Who are you?" Now she turned. Her face was deeply lined, the kind of lines that the Oklahoma sun carves into people who've lived their whole lives under it. Deep furrows around the mouth, around the eyes, across the forehead. a topography of years that no cream or shade could have prevented. Her eyes were dark and still. They looked at me in a way that wasn't curiosity. It was recognition, as if she already knew who I was before seeing me. "My name is Opal," she said. "Opal Marsh." She paused. "And you're Nora Whitfield. Married name Dawson. Widow of Garrett. Mother of 3. Arrived last night with a blistered foot and a baby with fever and $23 in your pocket." My stomach tightened. "How do you know my name?" She placed 2 cups of coffee on the table, pushed the plate of cornbread forward, lowered herself into the chair across from mine with the slowness of someone who never hurries, because she learned long ago that hurrying doesn't help. "Sit down, Nora," she said again. "You've got a lot to eat and a lot to hear, and neither one gets done standing up." I sat. Not because she told me to, because I was hungry. And because something in her voice, in that calm, in that certainty, told me that leaving this kitchen would be leaving something I needed to know. I picked up the cup. The coffee was strong and black, exactly the way I take it, and I didn't ask how she knew. Some things you learn not to ask yet. Opal waited until I finished the first piece of cornbread before she spoke. She had the patience of a woman who understood that a body running on nothing doesn't hear well. Feed first, talk second. This house she began has a name. It was never put on a sign, never registered in any official record with this name. But everyone from the old families around here knows it. They call it the Caldwell House. Caldwell. I didn't let my face show anything. But she saw it anyway. She was watching me with the particular attention that very old people have when they're reading what you don't say. "I see that name isn't new to you," she said. "I heard it once. My husband mentioned it." Opal nodded slowly. "Garrett came here," she said, 3 times, in the months before he died. He was chasing down a story, an old story that involves this house, this land, and your family. I set the cup down. "My family. Your family, Nora. Both sides of it. The side you know and the side that's been hidden from you for 3 generations." From the back room, I heard Maisie call out, her voice still drowsy with sleep. I went to her, told her I was in the kitchen, that there was coffee and cornbread, that she should come when she was ready. She settled back. I returned to the table and looked at Opal. "Tell me," I said. But Opal shook her head. "Not the way someone refuses. The way someone redirects." "I'll tell you what I know," she said. "But only the frame. The rest you find yourself." She looked at me with those still, dark eyes. "Truth you dig up yourself is the only kind that holds. I'll point you to the door, but you walk through it." I wanted to argue. I wanted her to lay it all out, every piece, right there on the kitchen table next to the cornbread. But something in the way she said it made me stop. It wasn't a game. It wasn't withholding for the sake of power. It was the conviction of a woman who had lived long enough to understand that information given freely is information easily dismissed. But information earned through effort becomes part of the person who finds it. So I waited. In 1931, Opal began this land belonged to a woman named Hazel Caldwell. Hazel was the only legitimate daughter of William Caldwell, who owned a cattle ranch and property that stretched from Cimarron Creek to as far as the eye could carry in every direction. The kind of spread that the Oklahoma Panhandle produces when a person knows how to work with the land instead of against it. William died young of fever when Hazel was 18 and left everything to her. Land cattle, small debts, and a name that still meant something in this part of the state. She paused. The problem was the half-brother, William's older son from a relationship he never formalized. A man named Samuel Aldridge, who grew up knowing he wouldn't inherit anything on account of being illegitimate, and who spent his entire life building a resentment the size of the land he believed was rightfully his. Opal's hands rested on the table, old hands with swollen joints and veins standing in relief. Hands that had worked. When William died, Samuel waited for Hazel to marry, to settle in, to start making the ranch work. Waited for her to have a child, to get busy with life, to let her guard down. And when he saw the right moment, he moved. How, I asked. Opal looked at me. Paper, she said. That's how a clever man moves when he doesn't have force. With paper and patience. Samuel had an ally, a man named Harlan Dawson. The name hit me in the chest before she finished the sentence. Dawson. My married name. My children's name. Harlan Dawson was the clerk at the county courthouse in the nearest town. She continued. Man of trust in the community. Man who knew where every document was filed, who signed what, how an inheritance could be contested, how a signature could be adjusted. She let that word sit in the air. Adjusted. Harlan and Samuel forged documents, not crudely. They were two intelligent men who knew what they were doing. They manufactured a fictitious debt owed by William Caldwell, dated years before his death, that pledged the land as collateral. When William died without paying this imaginary debt, the land technically passed to the creditor, who happened to be Samuel himself, registered under a third party's name to avoid immediate suspicion. Hazel tried to contest it, but contesting a property claim in a county courthouse in 1931 as a woman, as someone the two men had already begun to discredit as ignorant of business and careless with her father's finances, contesting was swimming against a current they had built specifically for her to drown in. And her husband, I asked. Opal looked at me with an expression that said she'd been waiting for the question. Thomas Marsh, she said, and her voice dropped half a tone, not deliberately, but the way a voice drops when it touches something that still hurts after all the years. He was my grandfather. I went still. Caleb had appeared in the kitchen doorway. I didn't know how long he'd been standing there. He didn't move, just listen. Thomas was found dead in the stock pond 2 miles from here, Opal said. Drowned. He was a man who'd been swimming since he could walk. Never entered water without knowing how to get out. My stomach turned in a way I recognized. The same turn I'd felt when they told me Garrett had been found in the Cimarron. Garrett always knew how to swim. I'd said that to Warren when he gave me the news. And Warren had said accidents happen to everyone, Nora. I set my coffee cup down on the table carefully, slowly, as if the sound might break something that couldn't be broken yet. How long ago, I asked, and my voice came out more controlled than I deserved. 92 years, Opal said. Thomas died in 1933. 92 years. And Garrett went into the river 8 months ago. I didn't say that out loud. But Opal was looking at me as if she knew I was connecting the ends and was waiting to see me connect them without needing help. I swallowed. Go on, I said. Hazel lost everything in less than 2 years. The land was taken through a legal process that Harlan Dawson conducted with the elegance of a man who knew exactly which clauses of the law to bend without breaking them. Thomas was killed when he started investigating the forged documents with the help of an attorney from another county. Someone who owed nothing to Samuel or Harlan, and who for that reason was dangerous. With her husband dead and the land lost, Hazel was left with her young daughter and nothing else. But she didn't disappear. She was stubborn, Opal said. And for the first time since she'd started talking, I saw something close to pride cross her face. The kind of woman who doesn't bend. Opal stopped there. She looked at me, reading me, deciding how much more frame to give before letting me find the rest on my own. Hazel stayed in this house, she said. It was the only property Samuel couldn't take from her because it was in her mother's maiden name already deceased, and the legal cost of seizing it wasn't worth the effort. She stayed and she gathered evidence, letters, testimony, her own diaries where she recorded everything with dates and detail, and the original documents, the real ones, the ones that proved the debt was a fraud. Where did she get the originals, I asked. Opal looked at me for a moment before answering. Harlan Dawson had a son, she said. And that son, when he grew up, understood what his father had done. He was a different kind of man, with a different kind of conscience. Before he died, Harlan hid the original documents at home, thinking he would destroy them when he found the courage. He never found it. He died without destroying them, and his son found them and delivered them to Hazel, because it was the right thing to do. I stopped breathing. Harlan Dawson's son, I said slowly. What was his name? Opal didn't look away. Ernest Dawson, she said. Your husband's great-grandfather, Nora, which makes him your children's great-great-grandfather. The silence that followed was the kind that words can't fill. I let it exist. I looked at my hands on the table. I thought about the name I carried. Dawson. A name I'd always assumed was just one of those ordinary surnames scattered across the rural plains of Oklahoma, without special history, without weight. It had weight. I just hadn't known. And Hazel Caldwell, I said, my voice very quiet. Where do I come in? Opal leaned forward slightly. Hazel had 2 daughters. One of them, Lenore, left this house when she was young. After Hazel died, she married in another town, tried to leave behind everything that had happened here. Decided to bury the story. Didn't tell her daughter. Her daughter didn't tell her daughter. She paused. Your mother never told you anything, did she? I thought about my mother. About the little she'd shared about her own family, about how she'd always changed the subject. When I asked about her grandparents, about where the family came from, about the land that I'd sometimes overheard mentioned in fragments at family gatherings, that stopped abruptly when someone noticed I was listening. There's nothing left, Nora. What's past is past. That's what she'd say. Every time. Opal watched me arriving at it. Past, she said, but it didn't rot. It stayed here in this house, waiting. Hazel left everything in a hiding place she built upstairs. Documents, diaries, the original proof of the fraud. All of it preserved. All of it waiting for the right person to come find it. She stopped again. Then she said the thing that changed everything. But I'm not going to show you where it is. You're going to find it yourself. I'll tell you. It's in this house. I'll tell you it's upstairs. And I'll tell you that your husband found it before you, because Garrett came here 3 times. And each time he spent hours in this house reading and writing and asking questions that nobody had asked in decades. My chest tightened. Garrett was here. 3 times, Opal confirmed. In the last months of his life. The last time he told me he'd found enough to file a case. He'd found an attorney. He said he was coming back in 2 weeks to collect the most important documents and bring them to her. Her voice didn't waver, but her eyes changed. They took on the opacity of someone who has already finished crying a particular loss and carries only what remains. He never came back, I said. He never came back. She confirmed. Caleb moved away from the kitchen doorway. I heard his footsteps going toward the back of the house. I heard the back door open. He needed air. I understood. I needed it too. But I didn't get up. Opal reached into the pocket of her apron and pulled out a notebook. Black cover, spiral-bound, the kind you buy at a small-town office supply store. On the front, in blue pen and handwriting I recognized so completely that it hit me like a physical blow, was written a name. Garrett Dawson. Opal placed it on the table. Not in front of herself. In front of me. He left this here on his 3rd visit, she said. Told me to keep it. Said if anything happened to him before he finished what he'd started, I should give it to the right person. When the right person came. She looked at me with those still, dark eyes. You're the right person, Nora. I looked at the notebook, at the handwriting on the cover, at the curve of the G, the way the T crossed high, the way the letters leaned forward as if they were in a hurry to get somewhere. I knew that handwriting the way I knew my own face. I had read it on grocery lists and birthday cards, and the note he left on the kitchen counter the morning Eli was born that said simply, "You are the strongest person I have ever known. Back soon. Coffee's on." I opened the notebook. The first pages were scattered notes, dates, names, property registration numbers, references to statutes he'd looked up. The organization of someone who wasn't a lawyer but was trying to think like one, building a case from the outside, feeling his way through a system he understood from the clerical side, but not the legal side. On the 4th page, there was a diagram drawn by hand, careful, but not neat, the work of a man thinking on paper. In the center, a rectangle. Inside it, the words, Caldwell, Property Original Deed, 1897. Arrows radiating outward to other rectangles. Samuel Aldridge, Harlan Dawson, County Courthouse, 1931. Fraudulent proceedings. And further along the diagram, connected by a dotted line, another rectangle with 2 names inside it. Warren Dawson, Boyd Dawson, current possession. And below that, circled, written in capital letters that pressed so hard into the paper that the pen had nearly torn through. Nora, does she know who she is? I stared at those words for a long time. My husband alone in this kitchen, at this table with this old woman, writing in a spiral notebook from a dollar store, asking a question I never knew needed to be asked. You knew who I was before I did, Garrett. You went looking for my history while I was at home raising your children, not knowing I had a history to look for. I closed the notebook, pressed my palm flat against the cover, felt the cheap cardboard under my hand and the weight of everything it contained. Then I looked up at Opal, where upstairs I said. Opal met my eyes. A trace of something moved across her face, not a smile, but a shift. The kind that happens when someone sees what they've been waiting to see. That's for you to find, she said. You'll know where to look. You've got the training for it, even if you don't realize it yet. She stood, took the cups to the sink, and began washing them with her back to me. From the back room, Maisie called again. Mama, I'm hungry. I stood, tucked the notebook inside my shirt against my skin where I could feel the spiral pressing into my ribs. The cornbread is on the table, sweetheart, I called back. Come eat. And then I stood there in the kitchen of the Caldwell house with my dead husband's notebook against my chest, and an old woman washing cups at the sink, and my children waking up in a house that belonged to my blood in ways I was only beginning to understand. And I thought about what Garrett had written. Does she know who she is? I didn't know. I said silently to him, to the empty space where he should have been standing. I didn't know when you went looking. I didn't know when I lost you. But I'm finding out now. And the way I'm finding out is the only way I've ever learned anything that mattered, the hard way, one step at a time. With my children beside me, and the ground under my feet, and no map except the one you left behind. I wiped my eyes with the back of my hand, took a breath, walked to the back room where Maisie was sitting up on the quilt with her hair sticking in every direction, and Eli was lying on his back, his eyes open, his forehead cooler than it had been the night before. Not well yet, but better. And I held on to that better the way you hold on to a rope in dark water, because better is sometimes all you get, and all you get has to be enough. Caleb came in through the back door. His eyes were red, but his face was composed. He looked at me, looked at the shape of the notebook under my shirt. Didn't ask. Breakfast, he said. Breakfast, I said. And we went to the kitchen, all four of us, and sat at the table where Hazel Caldwell had sat 90 years before me, and Opal Marsh set out cornbread and coffee, and a small jar of wild plum jam she'd made from fruit that grew along the fence line, and we ate. We ate without shame, because shame about eating when you're hungry is a luxury I could no longer afford. Caleb had 2 pieces. Maisie ate slowly, seriously, the way she does everything. Eli took water from my finger and watched us all with those wide brown eyes. And somewhere upstairs behind a wall I hadn't found yet, in a hiding place I didn't know, existed documents that had been waiting for 92 years were still waiting. But not for much longer. Because I was here now, and I was the right person, and I was going to find what my husband died trying to bring home to me, even if I had to tear every wall in this house apart with my bare hands to do it. That is not how the story ends. That is how it begins. I waited until the kitchen was quiet, and Opal had taken Maisie out to the garden she kept behind the house, a small square of turned earth, where things grew because someone had decided they would. Eli was sleeping on a folded blanket on the kitchen floor, his breathing even his forehead cooler than the morning before. Not healed, but mending. And mending was enough to let me go. Caleb was sitting at the table cleaning dirt from under his fingernails, with the focus of someone who needed something to do with his hands, while his mind was somewhere else entirely. He looked up when I stood. "You're going up," he said. Not a question. "I'm going up. I'll come." I shook my head. "Not yet. Stay with Eli. If Opal comes back in, tell her where I am. But don't leave your brother alone." He didn't like it. I could see that in the way his jaw set, the same way Garrett's used to set when he accepted something he disagreed with. But he nodded. And I took that nod and went. The staircase groaned under every step. Each tread announced itself in a different pitch. The wood warped by decades of heat and cold and the slow, patient work of gravity on things that were built to stand. But not forever. I climbed slowly with one hand on the wall because the banister was loose, pulling away from its brackets no longer trustworthy. The morning light hadn't fully reached the upper hallway. The windows up here were small and covered on the inside by cloth that had once been curtains and was now just faded fabric, nailed to the frames, filtering everything into a dim amber haze. 3 doors on the upper floor. 2 on the left, 1 on the right. The one on the right was smaller than the others, lower. The kind of door you'd miss if you weren't looking set into the wall almost like an afterthought. The wood darkened by time, and the hardware rusted to a dull brown. I didn't go to it first. That's not how you search. 4 years in the county records office taught me something that most people never learn because they never need to. It taught me how to look at a space and see what it's telling you before you start asking it questions. You don't walk into an archive and pull the first drawer. You stand in the doorway and you read the room. You note what's organized and what isn't. You note what's been touched recently and what hasn't been touched in years. You look at the dust and you look at where the dust isn't, because absence tells you as much as presence. I opened the first door on the left. A bedroom, or what had been one, a metal bed frame with no mattress, a wardrobe with the door hanging from one hinge, a window that looked out over the front of the property toward the road. Dust everywhere, thick and undisturbed. Nobody had been in this room in a very long time. I noted the floorboards, solid. No sign of modification. The walls were plaster over lath uniform. No patches, no seams that didn't belong. I knocked on each wall at intervals. Solid. Consistent. Nothing hidden here. Second door. Another bedroom larger. A dresser with a cracked mirror. A rocking chair with a split-seat curtains that had rotted to threads. The same thick dust. The same undisturbed air. I knocked on the walls again. Solid everywhere. The floor was intact except for one corner where water damage had buckled 3 planks. Nothing underneath but the joists and the ceiling of the room below. Then the small door on the right. I tried the handle. It came off in my hand loose from the screw, but not yet fully detached. The door itself didn't move. I pushed. Something was holding it from the other side. I ran my fingers along the edge of the frame and felt it. A metal bolt, old, probably rusted into place. A slide bolt mounted on the inside of the door. Inside, which meant someone had locked this door from within and left by another route, or someone had installed the bolt specifically to keep this door from being opened casually. I looked at the gap between the door and the frame. Narrow, but not nothing. I could see the edge of the bolt through the crack. It was seated firmly corroded into position by years of Oklahoma humidity and neglect. I went downstairs. In the kitchen, I opened the drawers one by one until I found what I was looking for. A thin-bladed paring knife, old with a wooden handle, dark from use. I tested the tip against my thumb. Still sharp enough. I went back up. I worked the blade into the gap between the door and the frame, found the bolt, and began applying pressure. Not force, pressure. Slow and steady, the way rust gives up its hold when you don't rush it. It took almost 2 minutes. My wrist ached and my fingers cramped around the handle. Then the bolt shifted with a dry metallic click, and the door swung inward. The smell that came out was old paper and trapped heat. The attic was a long, low space running the full length of the house, with the roof beams and clay tiles visible overhead, sloping down from a central ridge where I could stand upright to the eaves, where the clearance dropped to 3 feet. A small window at the far end, thick with dust, let in a single rectangle of morning light that fell across the floorboards and lit up the motes of dust that my entrance had disturbed, turning them into a slow galaxy of particles drifting in the still air. What I saw made me stop. It was not what you expect from an abandoned attic. Not the careless disorder of things discarded without thought. Broken furniture shoved into corners. Boxes piled without reason. It was the opposite. The space was organized. Not with the organization of someone who had tidied recently, but with the organization of someone who had arranged it once with intention, and whose intention had endured. Wooden crates lined the left wall, each one with a paper label attached by a thumbtack. The writing small and slanted in a hand I didn't recognize yet, but would come to know. A small table in the center held 2 books and a dried-out inkwell. A wooden chair with a woven seat that was fraying at the edges sat pushed against the table, angled slightly, as if whoever had last sat in it had stood up and never come back to push it in. And on the far wall, partially covered by a piece of heavy burlap hanging from a nail, something that looked like ordinary wall. Plaster and lath, same as the rest of the house. I walked to the crates first, read the labels. Correspondence 1928 to 1930. Legal proceedings. Land survey records. Witness testimonials. Personal effects. I opened the crate labeled Legal Proceedings. Inside paper. Lots of paper in varying states of preservation. Some sheets yellowed but intact. Others with edges softened by age, threatening to crumble if handled without care. But legible. All of it legible. I recognized what I was looking at immediately. Not the content, the format. I had spent 4 years filing documents exactly like these. Deed transfers, lien notices, court orders, property assessments, mortgage instruments. I knew the language, knew the layout, knew where to look on the page for the information that mattered. Registration numbers in the upper right corner. Witness signatures at the bottom. Notary stamps. Dates. I pulled out the documents one at a time and laid them on the table in the order that made sense to me. The order you'd use if you were building a chain of title working backward from the most recent to the oldest, establishing the provenance of a piece of land, the way you'd establish the provenance of anything valuable. Who owned it? When? How it changed hands? And whether the change was legitimate. The original deed was near the bottom of the crate, written on heavier paper than the rest. The ink faded to a pale brown, but every word still readable. William Caldwell, 160 acres. Legal description. Survey markers. No liens. No encumbrances. No debts of any kind attached to the property. Clean title. As clear as land gets. And then in a separate folder, the documents from 1931. The ones that had erased everything above them. A promissory note purporting to show that William Caldwell had borrowed a substantial sum against the property 2 years before his death. A lien filing dated 3 months after the note. A court order transferring possession to the creditor, one R.J. Prescott, who upon investigation would turn out to be a name controlled by Samuel Aldridge. I held the 2 documents side by side. The original deed clean. The promissory note fabricated. I didn't need a law degree to see the fraud. The paper stock was different. The ink was different. The notary stamp on the promissory note was crisp and sharp in a way that stamps from 1929 shouldn't be, because stamps degrade with use, and this one looked almost new. And the signature, William Caldwell's purported signature on the note, was close but not right. The W was too narrow. The final L didn't carry the same tail. It was a good forgery. But it was a forgery. I set those documents aside. Went to the burlap on the far wall. I pulled the fabric down. The nail it hung from was barely seated, almost falling out on its own. Behind it, the wall looked like the rest of the attic. Plaster over lath. Nothing special. I knocked. The sound was different. Not the solid, dense thud of plaster, backed by lath, backed by framing. This was hollow. A contained, boxy resonance like knocking on a cabinet door. I moved my knuckles across the surface, mapping the hollow area. It was roughly 2 feet wide by 2.5 feet tall, starting about a foot above the floor. I ran my fingers over the surface. The plaster was a slightly different texture in this area, smoother, applied with more care, as if someone had patched this section with particular attention to making it blend. But there was a seam, barely visible painted over, but there. A rectangle. In the lower right corner of the rectangle, I found a thumbprint-sized depression. I pressed. The panel shifted inward with a short, dry creak, then swung open on a center pivot. A hidden door no bigger than the door of an oven, balanced on an axis that someone had engineered with precision. The kind of work done by a man who understood wood and weight, and the importance of making something that would still open 50 years later. Inside was a cavity about 16 inches deep, lined entirely with sheets of old zinc nailed in place with small tacks. Protection against moisture. Protection against termites. Someone had thought carefully about what would destroy paper over time, and had defended against all of it. And inside that zinc-lined space, wrapped in pieces of burlap that had been stitched closed along the edges with heavy thread, were bundles of documents. I pulled them out one by one and carried them to the table. I used the paring knife to cut the stitching, and the burlap fell open. The first bundle contained diaries, 4 notebooks bound in worn leather, numbered on the first page with Roman numerals. 1111 Ione 4. The diary of Hazel Caldwell, written by her own hand, spanning the years from the beginning of the dispute to the last entry she was able to make. I opened the first one. March 13th, 1929. Samuel came to the house today. Says the inventory of Father's estate has a problem that needs to be corrected at the courthouse. Harlan Dawson will handle it. I didn't like the way the two of them looked at each other when they thought I wasn't watching. I closed it. There would be time to read the full diaries later. Now was the time to inventory what existed. The second bundle was what I needed most. The original documents that Ernest Dawson had taken from his father's files and delivered to Hazel. And among them, folded separately, placed on top, as if it were the most important item in the collection, a handwritten document on plain paper, undated but clearly old. Ernest Dawson's confession. The handwriting was different from Hazel's, less practiced, more labored. The writing of a man who didn't write often, and wrote this because he had to, not because he wanted to. Each line carried the particular weight of someone who understands that what they're putting on paper might destroy their own family's name. I, Ernest Dawson, son of Harlan Dawson, do declare under my conscience and before God that my father falsified the documents herein described, that the debt attributed to William Caldwell was manufactured in its entirety, that no such loan was made, no such obligation existed, and the transfer of property that resulted from these filings was obtained through deliberate and knowing fraud, perpetrated by my father in concert with Samuel Aldrich. I held that document for a long time, read it twice more, then set it down and picked up Garrett's notebook, which I had brought with me, and opened it to the pages I hadn't fully examined the night before. Garrett had been thorough, more thorough than I'd realized in my first quick reading in the kitchen. He hadn't just drawn the family diagram. He'd built a timeline. And in that timeline, he'd recorded something that the diaries alone wouldn't have told him. There was a list on the 7th page. 3 names, 3 dates, 3 locations. 3 men, all dead. Thomas Marsh, 1933. Drowned. Cimarron Creek Stock Pond. Investigating land fraud. Ruled accidental. Silvano Pratt, 2019. Drowned. Cimarron Creek, South Bend. Filed complaint about property boundaries with county assessor. Ruled accidental. Garrett Dawson. And next to his own name, a question mark. 3 men. 3 drownings. Same stretch of river. Same pattern. Decades apart. Each one had been asking questions about land that had been taken through forged documents. Each one had died in water. I set the notebook down and looked at the far wall of the attic, at the zinc-lined cavity still standing open, at the burlap wrappings on the table, at the documents spread before me in the thin light of the dusty window. And I felt something shift inside me. Not grief, though grief was still there, permanent and heavy. Something else. The shift from not knowing to knowing. The shift from suspecting to holding proof in your hands. Garrett didn't drown by accident. Thomas Marsh didn't drown by accident. And Silvano Pratt, whoever he was, didn't drown by accident either. 3 men 90 years apart, asking the same questions, dying the same way. I kept going through the notebook. Near the middle, a page written in a rushed, compressed hand, the letters tight, as if Garrett had been writing fast or with his hand shaking. Talked to Emmett Holloway. Worked for Warren 8 years. Fired when he started asking the wrong questions. Knows about Silvano Pratt's death. Says Warren and Grady left the ranch in Warren's truck at 3 a.m. the night Silvano went into the river. Emmett has security camera footage from the ranch gate. Motion activated. Timestamp matches. He kept a copy because Warren forgot the camera existed. Emmett is scared but willing to talk if he gets protection. Lives at the old Briggs place near Cimarron Creek. Green Gate. Green Gate. Emmett Holloway. Security camera. I read that entry 3 times. Then I turned back to Hazel's first diary and opened it to a page near the middle where the dates showed August 1929. August 14th, 1929. Thomas went to see the lawyer from Woodward County. Came back with an expression I recognize. The expression of a man who has found the size of the problem and doesn't yet know how to tell his wife. I told him before he told me. Samuel and Harlan forged the debt. The land is compromised on paper. He asked me how I knew. I said, I knew the way you know when you pay attention. He said he would fix it. I said we would fix it. He doesn't understand the difference yet. He will. He doesn't understand the difference yet. He will. Hazel Caldwell in 1929, sitting in this same house, writing about a husband she loved, but who still hadn't learned that protecting someone and including them are not the same thing. That shielding your wife from the truth is not the same as standing beside her while you both face it. Garrett had learned that lesson too late. The notebook proved it. My name with the question mark, the diagram, the realization somewhere in his investigation that this story was mine as much as his, that I was the one who needed to know. But he'd come to that understanding while he was still working alone, still carrying it by himself, still trying to arrive with the answer instead of the problem. And he died before he could hand me either one. 2 men 90 years apart, loving the women beside them in the same incomplete way, learning the same lesson from women of the same blood. And I was the one left standing holding both their unfinished work in my hands. I closed the diary, gathered the documents with care. The confession of Ernest Dawson and the original deed I folded and placed inside my shirt against my body, the way I'd carried Garrett's notebook. The rest I wrapped back in the burlap, stitched the seams roughly with thread I found in one of the crates, and returned to the zinc-lined space behind the wall. I closed the panel, hung the burlap back on the nail, and went downstairs. In the kitchen, Opal looked at me when I entered. She didn't ask what I'd found. She asked something else. The truck, she said. Did you see it? What truck while you were up there? White pickup. Stopped at the bottom of the track for about 10 minutes. Then left. Warren. I went to the kitchen window and looked out. The track was empty. The road beyond it was empty. The Oklahoma panhandle stretched flat and wide in every direction. Grass and red dirt and sky with nothing to hide behind and nowhere to disappear. How long ago, I said. 20 minutes. Opal was sitting at the table with Eli in her lap. Maisie was on the kitchen floor drawing in the dust with a stick she'd brought from outside, serious as a surgeon. He didn't come up the track, just sat there with the engine running. then reversed out and drove east. "He knows we're here," I said. "He knew before you arrived," Opal said. "Grady told him. Grady's the man who followed you on the road." I looked at her. "I need to make a phone call," I said. "Mr. Pritchard lives 2 miles out," she said through the back trail that runs along the creek. "Shorter than the road and less visible. He has a phone. He'll let you use it." She paused. "And he has a tablet, in case you need to photograph anything." I looked at her carefully. "You've done this before," I said. "Sent someone to Pritchard's." She didn't blink. "Garrett went the same way. 3 times. I went to find Caleb. He was sitting on the back porch, which was in better shape than the front, looking out at the garden and the scrubland beyond it. When I told him we were walking to Pritchard's, he stood without question. The stubbornness was there again, the quiet refusal to be left behind. And I didn't fight it. I didn't have the energy, and I didn't have the right. He'd earned his place in this. I told Opal to keep Maisie and Eli in the back room if she heard any vehicle on the road. She nodded. I knelt in front of Maisie and held her face in both my hands. "Stay with Miss Opal. Don't leave the kitchen. If you hear a car on the road, go to the back room and stay quiet." She looked at me with her serious eyes. "You coming back? I don't make promises I can't guarantee, but there are promises you make not because you're certain, but because the child needs the anchor of the word to hold on to while you're gone." "I promise," I said. She nodded, took hold of the edge of Opal's apron, and went with her. The back trail was narrow, beaten dirt lined on both sides with blackjack oak and switchgrass and bluestem that rose waist-high, where the sun reached through. I walked in front with my eyes on the ground and on the tree line on both sides. Caleb came behind me in a silence that was different from his usual quiet. Heavier. Thinking. Halfway there, he said it. "Mama, did Dad know something could happen to him?" I kept walking. I thought about the answer before I gave it. Because he deserved that. I think he knew he was digging into something that people didn't want dug up, I said. And he did it anyway. He did it anyway, Caleb. Quiet for a few more steps. He should have told you. He should have. Why didn't he? I'd asked myself that question during every sleepless night for 8 months. During every dawn when I woke in the dark. And his absence was physical. A thing with weight and temperature occupying the space beside me, where his body should have been. Because he loved me the wrong way, I said. Not wrong out of cruelty. Wrong out of protection. He thought shielding me was the same as loving me. But I didn't need shielding. I needed the truth. Caleb didn't respond. But I put my hand on his shoulder briefly as we walked, and he didn't pull away, which with a 13-year-old boy is sometimes the most you get. Pritchard's place was a 1/4 mile off the trail, a small clapboard house with a wire fence and a cattle dog sleeping on the porch, who lifted his head when we came through the gate, assessed us with the unhurried dignity of an animal, who'd long since stopped being impressed by visitors and went back to sleep. Pritchard came to the door before we knocked. A man in his 70s, thin as fence wire, wearing canvas work pants and a straw hat that looked as old as he was. He looked at us with an expression that wasn't suspicion and wasn't welcome. It was evaluation. the expression of a man with good instincts who lets those instincts do their work before he commits to anything. "Opal sent us," I said. His face changed. Not a smile, but an opening. A door that had been closed moving to ajar. "Come in," he said. The phone was an old cell phone, the kind with a small screen and no internet. The kind that gets a signal if you hold it at the right angle near the window on the east side of the house. Pritchard showed us the spot with a gesture and disappeared into the kitchen. I heard the sound of a kettle being filled. I pulled out the folded paper from inside my shirt. Garrett's handwriting, Lorraine Pickett, and a phone number. I looked at that paper for 1 second, not hesitating. I was past hesitation. It was something else. The recognition that when I made this call, something would change phase. There would be no returning to the point before. Not that the point before was available anyway. It was already gone. But this call would carry me into a section of road where the only direction was forward, and forward meant things I couldn't control and couldn't predict. I dialed. It rang 4 times. 5. Lorraine Pickett. The voice was firm, direct. A woman who answers the phone with her name because she knows that time is the scarcest resource there is. "My name is Nora Dawson," I said. "Maiden name, Whitfield. I'm the widow of Garrett Dawson. You were in contact with him about a land fraud case involving the Caldwell property." 2 seconds of silence. "Nora." The voice shifted. Not softer exactly. More present, the way a voice changes when the person on the other end stops doing 3 things at once and gives you their full attention. "I heard about Garrett's death." "I'm sorry." "Thank you. Where are you right now?" "At the Caldwell house, with the documents." Another pause, shorter. All the documents, including what was behind the wall upstairs. I heard her breathe on the other end. Not relief. Movement. The sound of someone repositioning, rearranging what they'll need. "Listen carefully," she said. "I need those documents in hand to file. With the original confession from Ernest Dawson and the Caldwell deed, we have sufficient basis to petition for nullification of the 1931 proceedings and restitution of the property to the legitimate heirs. But it has to move fast, because once Warren Dawson knows you have those documents in your possession, he's going to act. He already knows where I am. Then it's more urgent than I thought." She didn't lose her composure. "I can be there tomorrow morning early. But before I arrive, I need you to digitize everything. Photograph every page, front and back, every document. If anything happens to the originals, we need copies." I looked at the old phone in my hand. "I don't have a camera." "Pritchard has a tablet," she said. "He knows how to use it. It's been used for this before." I stopped. "You know Pritchard?" "I do. Garrett introduced us." A short pause. Nora Garrett wasn't working alone on this. There were people who knew people who were helping quietly. Pritchard is one of them. Opal is another. They were waiting for the right moment. I looked toward the kitchen door where Pritchard had disappeared. The old cattleman with the ancient hat and the sleeping dog on the porch. People who had been waiting the same way Opal had been waiting, the same way Hazel Caldwell had waited in her own way. Packing the documents in zinc, sewing the burlap, building the hiding place, trusting that someone would come. "I understand," I said. "Photograph everything today. I'll be there by 7 tomorrow morning." She paused. "And Nora, one more thing. Garrett told me something the last time we spoke. He said that when I met his wife, I'd understand why he did what he did the way he did it. He said you were stronger than you knew. I didn't know what to say to that. So I said nothing, which is sometimes the right answer. Tomorrow," she said. Tomorrow. Pritchard had the tablet in a leather case in a dresser drawer. He brought it out without my needing to explain why. Set it on the table, powered it on, opened the camera, and handed it to me with the matter-of-fact ease of a man who'd done this before. "Can you use it?" he asked. "Yes." "Then go ahead. I've got fence posts to set before dark." And he left. Simple as that. Caleb sat across from me while I photographed the documents I'd brought. The confession. The deed. Each page, both sides angling for the light from the window, holding the paper steady at the corners with careful fingers. I worked the way I'd worked in the records office, systematic, patient, thorough. Each image checked before I moved to the next page. When I'd finished what I had with me, I looked at Caleb. "We need to go back and photograph the rest. Everything in the attic. The diaries, the witness statements, all of it." He nodded. We took the trail back. The sun was lower now, the light coming in at an angle that stretched our shadows long and thin ahead of us. Halfway back, Caleb stopped. I felt his hand on my arm before I heard him speak. I already knew. When Caleb stops like that, it means his eyes have caught something his body hasn't processed yet. I've learned to trust that instinct in him the way I trust my own. What I said quietly. He indicated with his head a small motion toward the right side of the trail, where the brush was thicker, maybe 40 yards off the path. I went still. Listened. The normal sounds first. Wind, birds, the dry rattle of grass. And then, threaded through the expected sounds, one that didn't belong. Footsteps. Someone trying not to make noise, and because of the effort making the specific sound of a person restraining their stride, that slightly irregular rhythm of someone moving too slowly for the terrain, each step placed with exaggerated care. Grady. It had to be. The man Opal had mentioned. The one who'd followed us on the highway. He knew this trail. Probably knew it better than I did. But he was behind us, not in front, which meant he was following, not blocking. Gathering information, not taking action. Not yet. I didn't stop, and I didn't run. I kept walking at the same pace. I pulled Caleb forward gently by the sleeve and spoke without turning my head. "There's a curve up ahead, where the big Chinkapin oak is. For about 30 seconds, anyone behind us loses line of sight around that bend." Caleb understood before I finished. When we reached the curve, I stepped off the trail into the brush, pulling Caleb with me. We crouched behind the oak's broad trunk, and I pressed my finger to my lips. Caleb went down without a sound, eyes open, alert. Good boy. We waited. 20 seconds, 30. The man appeared on the trail, short, broad across the shoulders, wearing a faded cap and a plaid shirt. He walked, looking down at the ground in front of his feet, following our tracks in the dust. When he reached the spot where we left the trail and saw no one ahead of him, he stopped, looked forward, looked back. Stood there for 10 seconds, head turning, scanning the brush on both sides. I held still. Caleb held still. The man waited another moment, then shrugged and kept walking along the trail toward the Caldwell house. We let him disappear around the next bend. Then I stood and looked at Caleb. "He'll get to the house before us," he whispered. "Yes, but not if we go the other way." Pritchard had mentioned a second path almost in passing while I was photographing the documents. A gap in the brush about 100 yards north of the main trail that came out on the west side of the Caldwell property near the kitchen window. I'd filed it away without knowing yet why I filed the things I filed. But I filed them. I always have. We moved through the brush quickly and quietly. Came around the far side of the property. Just as Grady was knocking on the front door, I slipped through the kitchen window, which Opal always left open in the heat, and crossed the room fast. Opal was standing near the front door, still as stone, with Maisie holding her apron and Eli in the crook of her arm. When she saw me come through the window, her eyes showed no surprise, only controlled relief. I shook my head toward the door. "Don't open it." She understood. "Who is it?" she called loud enough to reach through the wood. "It's Grady. I work for Warren Dawson. Just wanted to check if you're all right, ma'am." The voice was practiced, not too tense, not too relaxed. Professional in a crooked way. The voice of a man accustomed to delivering lies with the rhythm of truth. "I'm fine, thank you," Opal said. "But I don't receive visitors at this hour. You can come back tomorrow if you need something." Silence. "You got somebody in there with you, Opal?" "I've got my own company, which is all I need." "Good afternoon, Grady." More silence. Then footsteps down the porch across the dirt yard. Fading. I went to the window in the front room and watched him go walking without hurry toward the road, with the unhurried step of a man who was leaving, but who would be reporting what he saw. Caleb climbed through the kitchen window a minute after me, slightly out of breath. He looked at me and I looked at him, and neither of us needed to say what we were both thinking. The clock was running. Whatever time we had was shorter than it had been that morning. I put the tablet and the documents on the kitchen table. "Now we photograph the rest," I said. "Everything in the attic, everything in Opal's box. Tonight. Because tomorrow the lawyer comes, and when she gets here, I want every page on record." Opal set Eli down on the blanket and went to the stove. "Dinner first," she said. "Serious work needs a full stomach." We photographed until the lamp began to dim. Caleb and I took turns going up to the attic. He carried the document bundles down, and I photographed them at the kitchen table near the lamplight. Page by page, both sides trying to capture the maximum detail. The 4 diaries were photographed in their entirety. The legal records, the witness testimonials that Hazel had collected over the years, signed statements from neighbors and townspeople, most of whom were long dead, but whose words survived on paper because a woman had thought to ask them to write down what they knew, and because zinc and burlap had kept those words safe from time. When I'd finished the last page from the attic, I returned to Garrett's notebook. I'd been through it once, but not with the kind of attention it deserved. Now, in the quiet of the kitchen with the children asleep and Opal sitting across from me, knitting something from rough yarn without looking at her hands, I read it again from the first page to the last, and on a page near the back that I'd passed over. The first time I found something I'd missed. It was written in smaller letters than the rest, cramped into the margin as if added as an afterthought, or as if Garrett had come back to this page later. and squeezed it in because there was no room anywhere else. EH has gate cam footage, motion triggered. Night of SP death. Shows WD truck leaving ranch 2:47 a.m., returning 5:12 a.m. Grady in passenger seat. Emmett kept backup copy on SD card. Warren doesn't know camera exists on that gate. EH will testify if protected. Greengate, Creek Road, Emmett Holloway. Security camera. Warren's truck leaving the ranch at 2:47 in the morning. Grady in the passenger seat. The night Silvano Pratt died in the river. Not just forged documents, not just stolen land. Murder recorded by a camera that Warren had forgotten existed on a gate he never checked. Saved by a man he'd fired for asking the wrong questions. I closed the notebook and sat very still for a long time. Opal's knitting needles clicked softly in the quiet. She didn't look up. She knew the way she always seemed to know, that I needed the silence to hold what I'd found. The next morning they came. I heard the vehicles first. Not one engine this time. Two. The distinctive rattle of Warren's white pickup and the smoother sound of a sedan behind it. They came up the dirt track without hesitating, without stopping at the bottom the way Warren had done before. This time they were coming all the way to the house. I was in the kitchen. Opal was already on her feet. "Take the children," I said. "Back room. The one with the window to the oak tree. Don't come out until I call." She didn't argue. Gathered Maisie by the hand, took Eli, disappeared down the hallway. I heard the door close. Caleb stayed. "Caleb, go with them. I'm not going to the back room." I looked at him. 13 years old. Taller than I sometimes realized, standing in the kitchen doorway with his jaw set and his shoulders squared and his eyes level. Garrett's eyes in Garrett's son's face, and behind them, the kind of determination that doesn't negotiate. "Stay behind me," I said. "Don't speak. Don't move unless I tell you." He nodded. I heard the truck stop in the yard. Doors opened. Voices low male. Boots on the dirt. I took a breath and went to the front door and opened it before they knocked. Warren stood in the yard with two men I didn't recognize. Grady was a step behind, arms crossed. Boyd was in the sedan as always, letting his brother do what needed doing. Warren had put on weight since Garrett's funeral. Or maybe I'd never noticed his size before, because before he was family, and now he was something else entirely. He looked at me with an expression that attempted casual and achieved only calculating. "Nora," he said. He used my name the way you use a tool. "You didn't need to run off like that. We could have talked." I stayed on the porch. I didn't step down. "I don't recall being invited to talk," I said. "I recall being told to leave." Things were said in the heat of the moment. He took a step forward, stopped when I didn't retreat. "You know how it is." Family was grieving. Tempers were high. "Your temper," I said. "Mine I kept." He stood there looking at me for a beat. The attempt at casual was gone. What sat beneath it was more honest and considerably colder. "What are you doing here in this house, Nora? I live here. You don't live here. This property has a complicated legal situation." "Complicated for you," I said. "Straightforward for me. I'm standing in a house that belongs to my bloodline, and never should have left it. The silence that settled after that had a different texture than any silence before it. Warren looked at me, looked past me into the hallway, looked at Caleb standing 2 steps behind me exactly as he'd promised. Then Warren's face did something I hadn't expected. It shifted. The calculation dropped away. Something else came up. Something that wasn't anger and wasn't arrogance. It was closer to exhaustion. The exhaustion of a man who has been holding a wall in place for a long time and has just felt the first crack run through it. "You went into the attic," he said. It wasn't a question. "I live here," I repeated. "Nora." His voice changed register again, lower, closer to the bone. "You don't understand the size of what you're pulling at." I pulled the card from my pocket, held it between 2 fingers where he could see it clearly. Lorraine Pickett, attorney at law, Oklahoma Bar Association. "My attorney filed this morning," I said. "Petition for nullification of the 1931 proceedings based on documented fraud. Original deed of William Caldwell with clean title. Confession of Ernest Dawson detailing the forgery conducted by his father Harlan Dawson in concert with Samuel Aldridge." Warren didn't move. Grady behind him looked at the ground. The 2 men I didn't know exchanged a glance. But I wasn't finished. "I know about the Pratt case, Warren," I said. "I know about Emmett Holloway. And I know about the camera on the East Gate." Warren's face went very still. Not the stillness of composure. The stillness of a man who has just heard something he believed no one alive knew. And then he said something I didn't expect. "I found out about the fraud 10 years ago." He said it quietly. Not to the men behind him. To me. As if they weren't there. As if it were just the 2 of us standing on opposite sides of something that had been building for nearly a century. 10 years ago, I pulled the old Caldwell records for a boundary survey. I saw the discrepancy in the deed. I pulled the thread, and the whole thing came apart in my hands. The forged note, the fake debt, the stolen property, all of it. I knew. He paused. I could have fixed it. I could have gone to the courthouse and filed a correction and let the property revert to whoever had legitimate claim. But fixing it meant losing the ranch, losing the cattle, losing the equipment, losing the Dawson name, which in this county still means something. Losing everything that 3 generations of my family built on top of a lie that the first generation told. His voice was steady, but his eyes were not. They had the look of a man standing in a room where a fire has started and knowing he's the one who left the stove on. "Your husband was gonna tear it all down," he said. "Every acre, every deed, every dollar. He was gonna put the Dawson name in a courtroom and let the whole county watch it burn." I looked at him, at this man who was my children's uncle, who had sat at my dinner table on Thanksgiving, who had held Eli the day he was born, and said he had Garrett's chin. This man who had discovered the same truth my husband had discovered, and who had stood at the same crossroads, and who had chosen the other direction. "You chose the land over the truth," I said. "Garrett chose the truth over his life. That's the difference between you." Warren held my gaze for a long time. The 2 men behind him were visibly uncomfortable. Grady hadn't moved. Boyd sat in the sedan with the engine off, watching through the windshield. Then Warren turned and walked back to his truck without another word. Not a threat, not a promise. Just the broad back of a man crossing a dirt yard toward a vehicle that would take him away from a conversation he couldn't win. Grady followed without looking at me. The two men went last. Doors closed. Engines started. The sound receded down the track and onto the road and faded into the distance until there was nothing left but the wind in the grass and the birds in the oak tree and the enormous silence of the Oklahoma panhandle, absorbing everything back into itself. Caleb behind me released a long breath. I didn't turn immediately. I stood on the porch looking at the empty yard for a moment, letting my heart find its rhythm again, letting my hands stop trembling, because they were trembling. I am not made of stone. When I turned, Caleb was looking at me with an expression I'd never seen from him before. It wasn't fear, and it wasn't relief. It was pride. The kind a son feels for a father, sometimes for a mother, rarely. Not because it doesn't exist, but because a son doesn't usually show it. This one showed it. I didn't say anything about it. I just said, "Go tell Opal she can come out." He went, and I went back into the house and closed the door and did what Opal always did when something difficult ended. I put water on to boil. That night, after the children were asleep, and Opal had gone to her room and the house was quiet, in the way only old houses can be quiet, full of small sounds that aren't silence, but aren't noise either. I sat in the kitchen with Garrett's notebook open in front of me and the lamp burning low. I turned to the page near the end, the one I'd read once before and needed to read again. Garrett had written it in his careful, deliberate hand, the letters leaning forward, each word pressed into the paper with the effort of a man who respected the weight of language. This whole story started with a woman who didn't back down. It's gonna have to end with another one. I sat with that sentence for a long time. He knew me before I knew myself. That's a strange way to be loved, but it is love all the same. I closed the notebook, pressed my palm flat against the cover, felt the spiral binding under my hand. Then I spoke into the dark kitchen, to the empty chair across from me, where he should have been sitting, to the absence that would never stop being absence, no matter how many documents I found, or cases I filed, or truths I dragged into the light. You went alone, I said, because you thought you were protecting me. But now, I'm going with everything you left behind. And I'm not going alone. I blew out the lamp, went to the back room, checked on my children the way I check every night, standing in the doorway, listening to 3 different rhythms of breathing until I'm satisfied. They're all still there, still alive, still mine. Then I lay down and closed my eyes and waited for tomorrow to come with everything it would bring. Lorraine Pickett arrived at 6:45 in the morning, 15 minutes earlier than she'd said, driving a silver sedan that was old but clean, the car of someone who maintains what they have, because replacing things isn't the point. I heard the engine from the kitchen where I was sitting with my second cup of coffee, already dressed, already awake for over an hour, already past the point of nervousness and into the territory of readiness, which is a different state entirely. Nervousness is the body not knowing what's coming. Readiness is the body knowing exactly what's coming and deciding to meet it standing up. She parked at the bottom of the track and walked up. I watched her from the kitchen window. A woman in her 50s, short with close-cropped gray hair, and a white blouse with the sleeves rolled to the elbow. She carried a leather portfolio under one arm and walked with the stride of someone who had been to harder places than this and hadn't wasted time being impressed by any of them. She noticed things as she came up the track. I could see her eyes moving. The tire marks in the dirt from Warren's truck, the sagging porch, the oak tree, the condition of the house. She was reading the property the way I read documents, scanning for what mattered before she got close enough to ask. I met her on the porch. She looked at me for 1 second, the quick assessment of someone who needs to understand fast who they're working with. Then she extended her hand. Nora, Ms. Pickett, Lorraine. Her handshake was firm, dry, without ceremony. She came inside, looked around the front room with the same practical eye, saw Opal in the kitchen doorway. Morning, Opal, morning. Coffee's ready. Then Lorraine set her portfolio on the table in the front room, opened it, took out a legal pad and a pen, and looked at me. Tell me everything. From the beginning, I told her. Sitting at the table with the morning light coming through the glassless window and the Oklahoma wind moving across the grassland. Outside, I told her everything from the morning Warren opened the door and said to leave. The conversation I overheard through the kitchen window. The walk in the heat. The house. Opal. The attic. The documents. Warren's truck at the bottom of the track. Grady on the trail. The documents photographed on Pritchard's tablet. Garrett's notebook. Emmett Holloway. The camera footage. And Warren standing in the yard the day before admitting he'd known about the fraud for 10 years and chosen to bury it. Lorraine listened without interrupting. She made notes, sometimes not always. She had the manner of a good attorney, the kind who lets you talk fully because she understands that what you volunteer is sometimes more important than what you're asked. When I finished, she sat quiet for a moment. The confession and the deed, she said. They're with you. I pulled them from inside my shirt and placed them on the table. She opened the confession with care, read it through, turned the page, read the second side. Then she opened the deed. She wasn't reading casually. She was verifying, cross-referencing against what she already knew, building the legal framework in her mind as she read. When she finished, she closed both documents and looked at me. "This is sufficient to file," she said. "With these 2 documents and Hazel Caldwell's diaries as supporting historical evidence, we have grounds to petition for nullification of the 1931 proceedings on the basis of proven fraud in the county records and restitution of the property to the legitimate heirs." She paused. "Which is you, Nora? You and your children?" I heard the words. Let them settle. How long, I said. She didn't spare me. A case like this, challenging a historical property record with the opposing party, represented by whatever attorneys Warren Dawson can hire when he finds out what we're doing. 2 years minimum. Could be 3. She looked at me directly, but there's something that changes the equation. Garrett's death. If we can establish that his death wasn't accidental, that he was killed because he was investigating this fraud, that transforms the nature of the case. It's no longer just a historical property dispute. It's a criminal matter, and criminal matters carry different weight, different urgency, and different pressure on a judge. She leaned forward slightly. The notebook entry about Emmett Holloway, the security camera footage. If that footage exists and shows what Garrett wrote, it shows we can petition for a criminal investigation into Garrett's death alongside the civil action. With Emmett's testimony and the camera evidence, we have basis for an inquiry. She paused. And that changes everything for Warren. A property dispute he can fight in court for years with lawyers and money. A murder investigation he cannot. I sat with that for a long time. The word murder in the kitchen of the Caldwell house spoken calmly by a woman in a white blouse, while my children slept in the back room, and the Oklahoma morning brightened outside. The word I had carried inside me for 8 months without ever speaking it aloud, because speaking it would make it real in a way that thinking it did not. Garrett was murdered. I had known it since the night they told me he'd drowned. Known it in my body before my mind caught up. Known it the way a wife knows when something is wrong with the person she's shared a bed with for years, not through evidence, through absence. Through the specific shape of the hole that's left when something is taken rather than lost. There's one more thing I said. Lorraine waited. The case needs to be public. She looked at me. I need people to know what happened. Not just the court, the community, the county. Because as long as this stays between lawyers and judges, Warren operates in shadow. The moment it's in the open, the moment there are names attached and facts on record, and people paying attention, it becomes too expensive for him to do what he's done before. You're talking about press, Lorraine said. I'm talking about the truth being somewhere it can't be buried again. She studied me for a moment. Then she reached into her portfolio and pulled out a business card. Margot Hensley, she said. Reporter at the Cimarron Gazette. She's covered 2 land fraud cases in the region. She's careful, she's thorough, and she understands how these stories work in small communities. I've worked with her before. She set the card on the table between us. If you're ready for what comes with it, because once that story runs, Warren Dawson's name is in print. His lawyers will come after the paper. People in town will have opinions. Some will support you. Some won't. Some will say you're making trouble, that you're after money, that you're tearing apart a family that's been part of this county for generations. I thought before I answered. I thought about Hazel Caldwell writing in her diary in 1929, noting the way Samuel and Harlan looked at each other when they thought she wasn't watching. A woman who saw the danger before it showed itself and wrote it down because she understood that the written word outlasts the silence that powerful men prefer. I've carried heavier things than opinions, I said. Lorraine nodded once. I'll call her today, she said. She left with the notebook and the photographs from Pritchard's tablet transferred to her phone. At the door, she stopped. One last thing. Warren is going to find out I was here. Grady or someone else will see my car, will talk. When Warren knows you have an attorney and that we've filed, he has 2 choices. Step back or push forward. She looked at me steadily. In my experience, a man who's killed before tends to push forward before he steps back. I know, I said. If anything feels wrong tonight or tomorrow, anything at all, you call 911 first. And then you call me. She handed me a card with her cell number written on the back. Don't wait until it's clear. Call early. I understood, I said. She went down the track with the same direct walk she'd arrived with, not looking back already onto the next task. I watched her car pull onto the road and disappear east toward town. And then I stood on the porch for a moment longer, looking at the empty track and the flat land beyond it, and the sky that was already turning the hard blue of a cloudless Oklahoma morning. The kind of sky that offers no shade and no mercy, but also no deception. What you see is what there is. The next day and a half passed in a quiet that wasn't peaceful, but wasn't hostile either. It was the quiet of the space between one thing and the next, the held breath before the exhale. Caleb stationed himself on the porch without being asked, watching the road with the patient attention of someone who has learned that watching is a form of doing. Maisie helped Opal in the garden, learning the names of plants the way children learn anything by repetition, and touch her small hands in the red dirt alongside Opal's old ones. Opal told her things. This here is lemon balm. Smell it. When your belly hurts or you're scared at night, you smell this and it helps. Maisie smelled it and said, "It smells like Grandma." Opal went quiet for a second. Then she said, "That's a fine smell." Eli crawled across the kitchen floor for the first time. Not real crawling, more dragging than anything coordinated, but moving under his own power, which made me sit down on the floor and watch him for a long time without doing anything else. A baby crawling doesn't need much of an audience, but he needs his mother to be there. He needs to look up and find her face, to know he's seen, that he exists, that he can go. I gave that silent witness while the sun crossed the kitchen from one side to the other. Margot Hensley arrived the following morning at 8. She came in a dusty hatchback with a backpack and a small recorder. And she was not what I expected, though. I didn't know what I'd expected. About 40 with braided hair, pinned high glasses with thick frames. She got out of the car looking around with the attention of someone who reads spaces before she reads people. She noted the oak tree, the sagging porch, the tire tracks Warren's truck had left. She noted the garden in back. She noted the way the house sat on the rise, visible from the road, but separate from it, the kind of place you could watch from a distance, but not approach without being seen. When she reached the porch, she looked at me directly and said, "Tell me everything I liked her for that." No long introduction, no protocol of friendliness, straight to what mattered. "Come in," I said. I told the story again, the fourth time now, to Opal, to Lorraine, to myself in the dark of the kitchen at night, and now to Margot. Each telling settled the story deeper into me the way flour sifts down and loses its excess, until only the substance remains. The first time hurts differently. By the fourth time, it starts to resemble testimony. Something you tell, not because you need to convince yourself, but because you understand that telling is part of the process of making truth permanent. Margot listened without interrupting. She made notes in a small lined notebook and occasionally paused her recorder when she sensed I needed a moment reading the change in my rhythm, before I was aware of it myself. When I finished, she asked to speak with Opal. I told her that was Opal's decision, not mine. Opal, when called, looked at Margot for a long time in the way she looked at everything, evaluating, letting her instinct work. Then she sat down at the table and said, "You can turn that recorder on." Margot stayed nearly 3 hours. She photographed the wooden box of documents with her phone camera. She photographed the front of the house, the attic, the false walls standing open with the zinc-lined cavity visible. Caleb went up with her and showed her the space, and she photographed everything with the methodical patience of someone who understands that evidence needs to be documented from every angle. She photographed the tire tracks in the yard. Before she left, she stood at the door with her backpack on. "When this runs," she said, "and it will run this week, because this is not a story you hold in a drawer. Warren Dawson's name will be in the paper. His lawyers will contact me trying to kill it or delay it or demand right of reply. I've been through that before." She looked at me. "You'll go through it too. People will question the story. They'll say you invented it, that it's opportunism, that you're after money or revenge or attention. Are you ready for that?" I thought about Hazel Caldwell writing in her diary. I thought about my great-grandmother Lenore leaving this house as a young woman, trying to bury a history that was too heavy to carry, believing that burying protected the people who came after. I thought about Garrett in this attic with his notebook writing my name with a question mark. I've endured heavier things than opinion, I said. Margot made a gesture with her head that wasn't quite agreement and wasn't quite admiration. It was recognition. The way one woman recognizes another when she sees that the other has been tested and held. "All right then," she said. And she left. The article appeared 2 days later in the Wednesday edition of the Cimarron Gazette. I didn't see it first. Lorraine called on Pritchard's cell phone, which I now carried with me at 7:15 in the morning before I'd finished my coffee. "It's out," she said, "and it's moving." Her voice was controlled the way it always was, but underneath there was a new layer, the vibration of someone processing something larger than anticipated. 3 outlets have picked it up already. Regional Wire Service, Tulsa World called the Gazette for comment. Warren's attorney contacted Margot at 6 this morning trying to get a retraction. She paused. "And there's something I didn't expect." "What?" "2 families from the county. They saw the article and reached out to my office before 9 o'clock. Both of them say they experienced similar situations with properties that were theirs. Pressured, intimidated, lost land through records they couldn't contest because they didn't have the resources or the knowledge to fight." She let that settle. Warren didn't do this only to the Caldwell family, Nora. He did it to others. And now those others are seeing that someone spoke. I stood in the kitchen, holding the phone with both hands, looking through the window at the garden where Opal was already working with Maisie, their morning routine established in just a few days. The way certain things become routine when they're in the right place. I thought about Hazel upstairs in the attic sewing burlap around documents, packing them in zinc, thinking about someone who would come. Not knowing that when that someone came, the thread she'd left would lead to other threads, other families, other names that also needed to be spoken. Heavy things, Sink Opal had said. It takes time, but they sink. "What does this change?" I asked Lorraine. "For the case, it changes the scale. I can broaden the action to include investigation of the other properties. With multiple documented cases, the district attorney's office has grounds to get involved. This isn't one family's grievance anymore. It's a pattern." She breathed. "This gets big, Nora. I know. Are you ready? I looked at the kitchen. Opal and Maisie outside their knees in the dirt. Caleb appeared in the doorway with Eli on his hip, both of them wearing the rumpled expression of recent sleep, heading straight for the coffee without seeing me yet. Family. Not the family I'd had before. The family that was forming, assembled from the pieces that survived, and the pieces I hadn't known existed. I'm ready, I said. That afternoon, the phone rang again. I was sitting on the back porch watching Eli try to grab fistfuls of the red dirt, fascinated by the texture opening and closing his hands with the pure concentration that only babies bring to discovering that the world has substance. The number on the screen was one I didn't recognize. Pritchard, standing nearby as he sometimes did in the afternoons, now stopping by on his way back from checking fence, glanced at the phone and said quietly, "That's Warren's line." I answered. Nora. Warren's voice was different from the last time I'd heard it in the yard. Still controlled, but the foundation under the control had cracked. There was a fracture in it that hadn't been there before, the fracture of a man who had spent 2 days watching his name appear in places he couldn't reach, couldn't edit, couldn't make disappear. Warren, you didn't need to do all this, he said. The paper, the attorney, the whole thing. We could have handled it between us. There was never a conversation between us, Warren. There was you telling me to leave and me leaving. Those are different things. Silence on the line. Long enough that I could hear the wind on his end wherever he was, and the low hum of a vehicle engine idling. "What do you want?" he said. It was the first time he had ever asked me that question. In all the years I'd known him through holidays and funerals and Sunday dinners, and the birth of each of my children, Warren Dawson had never once asked me what I wanted. He stated, he instructed, he decided, he informed. Asking was not in his vocabulary because asking implies that the other person's answer matters. And Warren had built his life on the assumption that certain people's answers didn't. Now he was asking. And I let the weight of that shift sit for a moment before I responded. "I want the truth on the record," I said. "Every name in its right place, every acre accounted for. Every family that lost property through forged documents to be heard and compensated. And I want Garrett's death investigated by people whose job it is to investigate, not by a widow with a notebook and $23. Another silence. "That'll destroy the Dawson name," he said. And his voice had dropped to something that was almost not quite, but almost a plea. "Your children carry that name, Nora. Caleb Maisie, the baby. They're Dawsons. Whatever you do to that name, you do to them." I had thought about this, not casually, not in passing. I had lain awake in the dark of the back room with my children breathing around me and turned this question over and over like a stone in my hand, feeling every edge. The Dawson name, my children's name, the name on their birth certificates, on their school records, on every piece of paper that would follow them through their lives. And attached to that name now a history of fraud and violence, stretching back nearly 100 years. What do you do with a name like that? Do you protect it by keeping the truth buried? Do you let your children grow up carrying it without knowing what it carries? Do you sacrifice justice for the comfort of ignorance? They'll carry it knowing what it means, I said. That's better than carrying it blind. The line went quiet for a long time. So long I thought he'd hung up. Then he said very quietly, "You weren't like this before." "I was," I said. "You just never paid attention." I ended the call, set the phone down on the porch railing, sat there with my hands in my lap for a while looking at the garden, at the red dirt, at the sky. Opal came around the corner of the house with a basket of herbs. She looked at me, read what was on my face. "He called," she said. Not a question. Called and asked what I want. First time. Opal lowered herself onto the porch step beside me with the careful movements of a woman whose bones have earned the right to complain. "That's when they know they've lost the ground," she said. "When they stop telling and start asking." 3 days later, Lorraine called with news that arrived in 2 parts. The first part was the civil case. The petition for nullification had been filed. The emergency protection order had been submitted. She expected the judge to rule on the protection order within the week. The second part was harder. "Grady came to my office yesterday," she said. I went still, walked in off the street, sat down in the waiting room and asked to speak with me. This was not a thing I had anticipated. Grady Warren's man, the one who had followed us on the highway, who had tracked us on the trail, who had knocked on the front door while I stood silent behind it. What did he want? He wants to testify. Against Warren, against Warren. He says he wants no further part in any of it. Says he's done. I turned that over. Grady on the trail walking with careful steps, trying not to be heard. Grady at the front door, his voice practiced and professional in its dishonesty. A man who had spent years doing Warren's work, the kind of work that doesn't get written in job descriptions, the kind paid in cash and silence. Could be a setup, I said. Could be, Lorraine agreed. But what he told me in that office is not the kind of information Warren would plant. It was too specific, too detailed. Things Warren would never want spoken aloud. She paused. He says he drove Warren's truck the night Silvano Pratt went into the river. Says he was in the passenger seat, which matches what Garrett wrote in the notebook about Emmett Holloway's camera footage. Says Warren told him it was just a conversation, that they were just going to talk to Pratt, and that what happened at the river was not what he agreed to. He says he's been carrying it for years and watching his own back every day since, because he knows what Warren does to people who become liabilities. She let that settle. He's not coming forward out of conscience, Nora. He's coming forward because he saw the article. He saw the other families, he saw the legal filings, and he did the math. He knows Warren is going to need someone to blame when this reaches a courtroom. And he knows who Warren will choose. Self-preservation, I said. Lorraine's voice was even. It's the most reliable motive there is. People lie about courage and they lie about principle, but they rarely lie about wanting to save themselves. I thought about Grady following us on the highway that first day. 3 children and a woman with $23 walking in the heat, and behind them at a distance a man who was watching because he'd been told to watch, not to act, to observe and report. And he'd done that. He'd observed. He'd reported. But when Warren told him to do more, when the instruction moved from watching to something else, he'd come to the house and knocked on the door and asked Opal if she was all right. And when she told him to leave, he'd left. It wasn't courage. It wasn't even decency exactly. It was the hesitation of a man who could follow orders up to a line but couldn't cross it. And now that line had become the thing that might save him. "What does this mean for the case?" I asked. "With Grady's testimony and Emmett Holloway's camera footage, we have sufficient basis to request a formal criminal investigation into the deaths of both Silvano Pratt and Garrett Dawson." She paused. "I filed the request this morning. The district attorney's office accepted it." I held the phone and didn't speak. Criminal investigation into the death of Garrett Dawson. The words existed outside of me now in a legal filing in an official record, in the language of a system that was being asked to look at my husband's death and call it what it was. Lorraine spoke again. "The protection order was granted this morning as well. Judge signed it at 9. You and your children have the legal right to remain on the Caldwell property for the duration of proceedings. Warren is prohibited from approaching, from sending representatives, from exercising any form of pressure or interference. Violation is criminal contempt." I sat in the kitchen with the phone in both hands and the morning light pouring through the window onto the table where Hazel Caldwell had sat 92 years before me, writing in her diary, recording the truth, because she believed the written word outlasts the silence that men prefer. "Thank you," I said to Lorraine, and it was inadequate the way that word always is when the thing you're thanking someone for is too large for the word to carry. "It's what needed to be done," she said. "Rest today if you can, Nora. There's more paperwork tomorrow." I didn't rest exactly, but I did something close to it. Something I hadn't done since arriving at this house. I went to the attic alone. Not for documents, not for evidence. I went with Hazel's first diary and nothing else. I climbed the groaning stairs, slowly opened the small door that no longer resisted, since I'd freed the bolt and entered the long, low space with its smell of old paper and warmth. The afternoon light came through the small window at a low angle, casting a golden rectangle across the floorboards. I sat in the chair with the fraying seat and opened the diary to the first page and began to read. Hazel wrote well. Not the way a literary person writes with flourish and self-consciousness. The way a precise person writes. Every sentence carried exactly the weight it needed. No excess, no shortage. A woman who didn't waste words because she understood that words cost time and ink and energy that might run out. June 22nd, 1929. Went to the courthouse today with Mrs. Perkins, who witnessed Father's wedding. Harlan Dawson would not see me in person. Sent a clerk to say the archive was being reorganized and I would need to wait. This is the third time I have received this answer. I no longer believe in coincidence. I turned pages. August 14th, 1929. Thomas went to see the attorney in Woodward County. Came back with the expression I recognize. The expression of a man who has found the size of the problem and doesn't yet know how to tell his wife. I told him before he told me. I said they forged the debt. The land is compromised on paper. He asked how I knew. I said I knew the way you know when you pay attention. He said he would fix it. I said we would fix it. He still doesn't understand the difference. He will. And later, after Thomas died, the entries became shorter. Cut. Each sentence ended before it should have truncated the writing of someone who was recording because she had to, and containing what she wanted to say, because saying it fully would break the composure she needed to continue. March 2nd, 1933. They found Thomas in the stock pond. They said accident. I know it was not. I don't have proof yet. I will. 3 sentences. period after each one. A woman holding too much with too little space. And weeks later, an entry that stopped me. I cannot show that I am afraid. If I show it, they know they succeeded. And if they know they succeeded, they stop believing they need to do more. I read that and sat still. I thought about my own face on the porch when Warren stood in the yard with his men. The card between my fingers. The voice that surprised me coming out of myself, steady and clear and firm, in a way that didn't come from the body. It came from somewhere deeper, from somewhere I didn't know existed, until I needed it. It wasn't a strategy I'd learned. It was something that had been in me before I knew it was there. Passed down through a line of women who had needed the same thing to survive. Don't show fear, not because you don't feel it, because showing it gives information to people who will use information against you. I read until the light began to fail. I didn't finish all 4 diaries. There wasn't time for that. But I read enough to know Hazel Caldwell the way you know someone whose writing lets you into the room where they were thinking. And I read the last page she had written, which was different from the rest. No date, no careful record. Just a single line written in letters larger than anything else in the diary, as if she had needed more space for it, as if the sentence required room to breathe. This land knows the names of those who belong to it. It calls them back. I closed the diary. Look through the dusty window at the Oklahoma Panhandle stretching out in every direction, vast and red gold in the late afternoon. That enormous sky that never compromises, never softens, just presents itself as it is and lets you decide what to do with it. I placed my hand flat against the old wood of the attic wall, felt the grain under my palm. The warmth of the wood that had absorbed decades of sun. I didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that presence didn't already say. Then I went downstairs. The kitchen was full. Caleb at the table with a notebook Opal had found in a cabinet, making what looked like a list or a plan. His head bent, his pencil moving. Maisie on the floor with Eli. The 2 of them engaged in a game that only they understood. Maisie narrating in her serious voice and Eli responding with the sounds he had, and somehow it worked. Somehow. They were communicating across the gulf between 6 years and 8 months, in a language that had no words but had everything else. Opal at the stove with her back to the room, stirring something that smelled of garlic and onion. Pritchard had sent over a piece of salt pork with his grandson earlier that day, delivered from horseback, without the boy even dismounting. I stood in the doorway and watched. There are moments you need to stop and observe because they are the kind that don't repeat. Not because it's the last time. It might happen 1,000 times more, these same people in this same room. But it's the first time it's happening this way. And first times carry a weight that repetition can't reproduce. The protection order came through, I said. Opal didn't turn. Caleb lifted his head, looked at me. His eyes were steady. "We can stay," he said. "We can stay." He nodded, went back to his notebook, but his posture changed. The shoulders loosened. The neck released tension I had seen in him since the morning we left Warren's house, and that I had pretended not to see, because he was pretending not to feel it. Maisie looked up without understanding the content, but reading the tone. "Good news, Mama, yes, sweetheart. Then we should eat," she said. "That's better than celebrating. I almost smiled. Can we do both? She considered this with the gravity she brings to all decisions. Can it be both? It can be both. We ate dinner with the door open to let in the end of the day. The table wasn't big. Opal fit comfortably alone at it. 2 people fit without crowding. With 5, it was tight, but the kind of tight that doesn't bother you. The kind that means everyone is close enough to reach. Caleb in the corner. Me beside him with Eli on my lap, reaching for everyone's plate with both hands. Maisie between Opal and me, serious with her spoon. Opal had made the salt pork with black-eyed peas and cornbread, the food of someone who lives on little but lives with sense. She cooked without hurry and without apology. And when she set the plate in front of me, I ate without shame, because shame about eating when you're hungry is a luxury I had surrendered the night I arrived here, with $23 and nothing else. Caleb ate 2 helpings and didn't apologize. Maisie asked what the green thing was in the beans, and when Opal told her it was a pepper from the garden, she said she wanted to grow peppers too. Opal said pepper plants need full sun and patience. Maisie said she had both. Opal looked at me sideways with the expression she wore when something surprised her in a good way. But she wasn't going to say so. Eli ate mashed cornbread soaked in the pot liquor from the beans and was satisfied, which reminded me that satisfaction has a scale. A baby is satisfied with cornbread. A 13-year-old is satisfied with a full plate. And I was satisfied that night with the simple existence of all of them around the same table. Everyone present, no one missing. Garrett is missing, said a part of me. I know, I answered. And I let the 2 things exist together, which is what you learn to do with grief. You don't choose between the absence and what remains. You hold both. After dinner, while Caleb washed the dishes on his own initiative, a development that had surprised me the first time until I realized he'd watched Opal do it every night, and had arrived on his own at the conclusion that it was time to do his part, I went outside and sat on the porch. The east side where the boards were still solid. The sky was clear. The Oklahoma night sky without clouds is not a moderate thing. It's an excess of stars stacked on stars, more than any urban eye can process, more than seems possible until you're under it. I sat looking up without thinking about anything specific, which is a rare state for me. Usually the mind doesn't stop. It's always calculating, planning, anticipating the next step. But there was a pause in that. A genuine interval where the next step had already been taken, and the one after it hadn't arrived yet. And in that space, the small grace of simply being. Opal appeared with 2 cups of tea, handed me one without asking if I wanted it, sat beside me with the care of old bones and a sense of balance still good enough to trust. We sat without talking. The tea was lemongrass, faintly sweet, warm in the right way. After a while, I said what I'd been thinking. Opal, when all this is done, when the case is settled one way or another, what do you want? She turned her face toward me. What do you mean? If the order holds, if the case goes through, if the court recognizes this property as belonging to the Caldwell line, this house is as much yours as mine. More in many ways. Opal looked at me for a long time. Hazel would have liked you, she said. I'd have liked her, I said. Probably both. We were quiet again. The night breathed around us, I don't want anything I don't already have, Opal said after a while. I want this story told right. I want Hazel's name in a place that isn't just the memory of an old woman. I want Thomas Marsh not to be just someone who drowned in a stock pond. I want the fraud name for what it was with the names of the men who did it attached. She paused. The rest is process. Process I leave to you and Lorraine. Do you trust Lorraine? Garrett trusted her. Garrett was a man of judgment. He was. And me, I asked, not from insecurity, from genuine curiosity about what this woman who had taken me in without knowing me had concluded about me in the days we'd spent under the same roof. Opal looked at me sideways. I trusted you since you came through the kitchen window without making a sound, and looked me in the eye. Without flinching, she said. She turned back to the sky. A woman who comes through the window instead of knocking on the door, when the situation calls for the window, is a woman who understands when circumstances lead and protocol waits. That kind of judgment is rare. I almost smiled again. It wasn't judgment, I said. It was instinct. Good instinct is as rare as good judgment, she replied. Sometimes they're the same thing. I went to bed late. But before I went in, I stopped at the doorway of the room where my children slept. The door was half open. In the dark, I listened to 3 rhythms of breathing. Caleb's deep and heavy, the sleep of an adolescent who sleeps like stone when he truly lets go. Maisie's with that slightly irregular cadence I'd learned to recognize when she was an infant and never forgot. Eli's small and absolute, the breathing of a baby who fills his chest in a way that has no name but fills something in you too. I stood there listening, not from worry, from presence, from the need to confirm by ear what the mind already knew, that they were there, that they were well, that we had come through to the other side of one more day. Then I went to the small room near the stairs, the one Opal told me Garrett had used during his 3 visits. A table against the wall, a wooden stool, a window that looked out onto the oak tree. No personal objects. Garrett wasn't a man who left physical traces in the places he passed through. But I sat there anyway on the stool with his ring in my hand. I'd been carrying it in my pocket since the funeral. A simple band, common gold, the kind he'd chosen because he said a wedding ring should be something you could wear while working without being afraid of scratching it. There was a mark on one side where he'd caught it on a barbed wire fence once helping a neighbor fix his pasture line. I knew that mark with my eyes closed. I looked at the ring in the dark, just the dull gleam of metal catching whatever faint light came through the window. The history you went to find is being told, I said to the empty room. The people you gathered are together. The documents you saved are in the right hands. I don't know if that fixes anything. I don't know if it fixes the fact that you're not here to see it. But it's what I have to give. I slipped the ring onto my index finger, the only one it fit. Not a gesture of mourning, a gesture of carrying, of saying you come with me into whatever is still ahead, the way you came with me into everything that's already behind. I looked out the window. The oak tree's branches crossed the glass, moving slightly in the night wind. The same tree Maisie had learned the name of. The same one I'd begun using as a reference point whenever I needed to orient myself in this place that was becoming mine. Not because a court had said so, not yet, but because I had walked into it and recognized it and decided to stay. In the morning, I woke before the sun. not with the tense vigilance that had marked every morning since leaving Warren's house. Something had shifted, not resolved. Resolution would take years by Lorraine's estimate, and might take longer. Not without fear. Fear was still there, the functional kind Opal had described, the kind that keeps you alert. Not without Garrett's absence, which would never stop being absence, only change shape over time, from sharp pain to steady weight distributed across the body in a way that allows you to carry it. I woke simply as a woman who knows where she is and knows what she does next. That's not much said, something inside me. It's enough, I answered. I went down to the kitchen. Opal was there, as she always was, coffee on the stove, cornbread on the board, the window open to the pre-dawn air that carried the smell of grass and red earth, and the faint sweetness of the lemongrass she grew along the garden fence. I sat at the table. She gave me coffee without my asking. "Lorraine is coming today," I said. "She wants to photograph the whole property for the case file." Opal nodded. "And after that," I said, "I'm gonna start figuring out what needs fixing in this house." I looked at the ceiling, at the water stain in the corner that had been there for years, spreading slowly, patiently, the way damage does when no one stops it. The porch needs new support beams. The roof in the back room has cracked tiles. The garden can be expanded. Opal watched me with her quiet expression. "That'll take time," she said. "I know." I took a sip of coffee. "But things that matter take time." She was silent for a moment. Then she said, "Hazel expanded the garden 3 times. The last expansion was the year before Thomas died. She planted black-eyed peas, corn pole beans. Said, 'Good land can't sit idle. Good land can't sit idle.'" Caleb came down before Maisie, carrying Eli on his hip, both of them wearing the crumpled faces of early morning. He went straight for the coffee, which he'd started drinking black since we arrived. Another small change I'd noticed without commenting on, because 13-year-olds need their changes acknowledged by not being acknowledged. He sat at the table, looked at me. "The lawyer's coming today." "Yes. Need help with anything?" "No. But if you want to understand how it works, you can stay and listen." He considered this. "I want to understand," he said. 13 years old. Son of a man who died investigating an injustice, sitting at the table in the house that injustice had stolen. Saying he wanted to understand how things work. Garrett would have been proud to see it. I was proud in his place, which is what you do. "Then stay," I said. Maisie appeared a few minutes later. Hair in all directions. Eyes half closed. Guided by the smell of coffee toward the table the way a compass needle finds north. Opal gave her a cup of warm milk with a splash of coffee before she had to ask. Eli slapped his palm on the table, pleased with some private discovery. And the morning went on happening with coffee and cornbread, and the sun coming through the open window, and the oak tree outside, and the garden with the lemon balm that Maisie had learned the name of, and the pepper plant she wanted to grow, and the red Oklahoma dirt that held everything together, the way it had for 100 years. Before Lorraine arrived, I went to the garden alone, knelt in the dirt where Maisie had planted a handful of basil seeds 2 days earlier, under Opal's instruction. The seeds hadn't sprouted yet. They were down there in the dark, doing what seeds do, which is nothing visible and everything essential. I put my hand on the earth, warm on top from the sun, cool underneath where the moisture lived. I thought about Hazel kneeling in this same dirt or near it, the same earth underneath, the same sky above. It didn't matter what had happened on top of this ground. The land didn't hold grudges. It only held what was planted. I was beginning to understand what Opal meant when she said she didn't want the land itself. She wanted the story told right, because the land was a consequence. What mattered was the record of what had happened, the names of who did what, the truth placed where it could not be buried again. The rest was process. And process, I had learned, is not destiny. It is work. When Lorraine's car appeared at the bottom of the track, I stood and went to the porch and waited. She came up with her portfolio and her legal pad, and that direct stride. She looked at me from the distance the way she had the first time assessing. But this time the assessment was different. She was seeing someone who had changed from one week to the next, and she was noting the change. "You look different," she said when she reached the porch. "I am different," I said, "but the work is the same." She made a gesture with her head that was agreement and respect together. "Then let's get to it," she said, and we went inside. There are things that don't end in a day. The case will run for months, possibly years. There will be hearings and motions and filings and signatures and days when the bureaucracy will feel larger than everything. Warren will hire the best attorneys that money taken from other people can buy. And those attorneys will try every angle the law allows, and some it doesn't. There will be days I wake up with Garrett's absence so heavy I won't want to stand. And I'll stand anyway because that's what you do. There will be days Maisie complains about the new school we'll have to find, and Caleb goes quiet with things he should be saying. And Eli runs a fever at 2 in the morning, and I spend the dark hours with my hand on his forehead. There will be days I look at this house and see everything that needs repair, and not know where to begin. But there will also be the day the judgment comes. The day Hazel Caldwell's name appears in a legal document, recognized by the state as a woman who was wronged, whose property was taken through proven fraud. The day Thomas Marsh's name appears in a record that says this man did not die by accident. The day Garrett's name appears in the same record. And the day my children grow up knowing who they are. Not the version Warren wanted to exist, the version of a family without roots, without history, without claim to anything. The true version. Descendants of Hazel Caldwell, who didn't back down. Of Ernest Dawson, who had the courage to correct his father's wrong. Of Garrett Dawson, who went looking for the truth alone because he loved, in the way he knew which was imperfect, but was real. They'll know that the house they live in was built by hands that belonged to our family before the word family existed for us. That the land under their feet was defended by a woman who wrote in a leather diary because she believed the written word outlasts enforced silence. That the pepper plant Maisie wants to grow will take a full season to bear fruit. And that's fine, because she learned from a 91-year-old woman that some things only grow in the time they need. That evening after Lorraine left and the paperwork was signed and the case moved forward another step, I sat on the porch one last time. The sky was clear. The oak tree moved in the evening wind, its branches reaching in every direction. Unshaped, unpruned, a thing that had found its own form without anyone telling it what to be. Opal came out with tea, sat beside me. We didn't speak for a long time. Then she said, "You'll stay." It wasn't a question. It was an observation. The kind a very old person makes when they've arrived at a point in the story where the ending isn't written yet. But the direction is clear. "I'll stay as long as I need to," I said. "And then I'll stay because I choose to." I paused. Those are two different things. The second one is better. Opal lifted her cup. She didn't toast. She wasn't the type. But she drank with attention present in the gesture. And I did the same. And it was enough. Later, when the house was quiet and everyone slept, I went to the back room and stood in the doorway listening to my children breathe. 3 rhythms in the dark. Caleb deep. Maisie her own uneven music. Eli small and whole. I took the ring from my index finger and held it in my palm. Felt the smooth metal, the scratch from the barbed wire fence. Then I put it back on. Not because of grief, because of carrying. Because of all that remained to be done and all that had already been done. And the distance between those two things, which was the distance of a life. "Garrett," I said inside without voice, "this doesn't end with me finding what you left behind. This ends with our children knowing who they are. And that's a longer road than any court can measure. But I'm on it. And I'm not turning back." I lay down, closed my eyes, listened to the house settle around me, the old wood adjusting to the cooling air, the familiar creaks and sighs of a structure that had been standing for over a century and intended to keep standing. Outside, the Oklahoma night stretched wide and dark and full of stars, and somewhere in the distance a coyote called once and fell silent, and the wind moved through the grass, the way it had moved through the grass since before anyone built anything on this land, or claimed it, or fought over it, or died for it. The land remained. It always does. Patient. Indifferent to the arguments of men. Waiting only for what is planted and giving back in its own time exactly what is sown. And in the morning there would be coffee to make and children to gather, and papers to sign, and a garden to tend, and a house to repair, and a story still being written one page at a time, in the hand of a woman who learned late who she was, and would not forget again. There was dinner to make, children to gather, and land waiting to be planted.